All right, I want to talk about for a few minutes the practicality of a seminary education and do this primarily, at least initially, by way of a testimony of my own experience. When I was converted and out of high school and college, I became involved in a ministry called Young Life, which is a ministry that's still going, that is an outreach ministry to high school kids. Non-Christian high school kids. And when I was involved in that ministry, I was a relatively new convert. And one of the things that you do is you have a Young Life club, which is a gathering of a lot of kids in the high school. And then you have a smaller group that's a Bible study group. And I was involved in both sides of that and working with high school kids, some new converts, some not yet converted, and talking to them about Christianity. It became apparent to me after a fairly short time in Young Life ministry that I wasn't equipped to deal with some of the questions and issues that they were dealing with. So I had to ask myself the question, how am I going to get equipped? Well, Young Life had a way of doing that. You were to go away and study at the so-called Young Life Institute, which became associated at some point with Fuller Seminary. Now, in the midst of all of this, I was recognizing I have got to be educated theologically, biblically, if I'm going to want to address some of these issues on a long-term basis. If I'm going to do this for more than a few years, if I'm going to be involved in ministry, what I need is a theological biblical education in order to do that. So the reason that I came to Westminster Seminary was because I recognized, first of all, that I didn't have what was needed in order to conduct the ministry that I wanted to be involved in. The interesting thing that I found when I was here as a student, this is just anecdotal, I'm not sure it's always the case, but when I was here as a student, one of the interesting things is that the people who were my peers, the other students who were studying here, the ones who had been involved in ministry prior to coming here, in some way, shape, or form, whether in the church or some other kind of ministry, those were the ones who understood the practicality of what we were learning in the classes that we were taking. And this, again, is a general statement, but generally people who come right out of college into seminary, if they've been involved in no ministry whatsoever, get very frustrated with the classes that they're taking and the things they're having to learn. I remember one student saying, this has absolutely, in one of our classes, this has no basis in reality. Who cares about this? And I remember after that stopping the student and saying, let me tell you how practical what you're learning actually is going to be when you're out there, when you graduate. So what's the point? The point is, what we do at Westminster is we train ministers who are going to go out into ministry, and what we try to do is give them that academic component, which I happen to believe is absolutely necessary if you're going to be involved in a lifetime of ministry. Let me put it to you another way. You may be familiar with Reformed University Fellowship, RUF, Ministry of the PCA. If I were 30 years younger, that's where I would be going upon graduation at Westminster Seminary. Why? Because what you have at the level of high school, at the level of college, you have these minds now being formed in significant ways. Many of these people for the first time asking huge questions, being asked huge questions in their classroom about the nature of, even the nature of business and why we ought to be in business and how does business relate to the economy, or the nature of the world itself, the nature of reality, sociological questions, psychological questions, business questions, even questions about mathematics and philosophy of mathematics. These things come onto you in college in a way that you haven't experienced before, sometimes in high school, but also in college, in a way you haven't experienced. Now, how do you begin to deal with those things? You begin to deal with those things if someone is there to help you address those questions from a theologically, biblically competent perspective. That is, you're not just studying the Bible in a way that's superficial. There's nothing wrong with that. We all need to do that to some extent. But you're with somebody who understands the depth of what Scripture teaches and why it says what it says and how it communicates. And that leads you into questions about what Scripture is. Is it really an authority? Why is Scripture more authoritative than Professor so-and-so who's questioning everything that I ever believed? Or why is Scripture more authoritative than this tenet that I've now adopted as a college student? You need somebody on the campus, whether high school or college, but now I'm thinking particularly about college campus. You need somebody there to grab you and to begin to help you think through some of the issues that are being addressed, some of the questions that are being addressed on the college campus, because that's when the mind oftentimes becomes alive to those issues that are out there in the world, the kinds of things you don't get so much when you're just at home and mom and dad are handling so much of those things for you. Now you're out there, now you're among them, now you're making decisions, now you're thinking about issues that you haven't thought about before. What you need is somebody who is theologically, biblically trained so that they can know something in profound ways, so profound that they can communicate it to you perhaps more simply. You need somebody who is, as Machen used to say, an expert in the Bible, which not only means that you are able to address things according to Scripture itself in the way that it speaks in Hebrew and in Greek. Not only that can you do that, but you're able to move up from your knowledge of Hebrew and Greek, your knowledge of Scripture itself, to theological truths that address questions such as, who am I? And why in the world am I here? Why should I even be studying this material in college? Maybe I shouldn't. But if I am, why should I be doing that? What difference will it make when I graduate if I study this, say, as a Christian, or just study it in order to get A's? What difference does that make? Those questions are deeply practical questions, and questions that need to be addressed from a Christian perspective. I am absolutely convinced you cannot address those questions superficially and do justice to the questions themselves. The way to address those is theologically and biblically, to have a competence in theology and the Bible that allows you to get onto campus and to address those very things with students whose minds are now activated in a way that they weren't before. Now, I'll say this about RUF ministry because I'm absolutely fundamentally committed to its premise. What you have in RUF that I didn't have in Young Life and wished I had is you have a church orientation such that these ministers on campus, these RUF ministers, have to be ordained in the church, qualified to teach. And in order to be qualified, you've got to be theologically trained. We're convinced, I'm convinced, the reason I'm here at Westminster, I'm convinced you don't have that unless you have a seminary education, unless you have been forced to delve deeply into the languages of the Bible, into your exegesis in Scripture, into the theology that moves up from Scripture, into apologetics, seeing those attacks that come onto the Christian faith and being able to think through how you might address those attacks from a theologically, biblically competent perspective. Not just philosophically. You can do the philosophical if you need to or want to, but fundamentally you don't have an apologetic apart from the Bible, apart from your exegesis, apart from your theology. If your apologetic arises from philosophy, throw it out, it's useless. If it arises from your understanding of Scripture and your theology, then it's informed with authority, with the biblical impetus behind it, with God's own power behind it, and so you can begin to address those challenges that come to Christianity by way of the things that you happen to be learning, whether in high school or in college. So here's the point. You must study hard academically and must delve into the academics so that you are practically useful in the service of Christ's church. I've heard people say this before about Westminster. Westminster is too academic. My response to that is, thank you. That's a compliment. That's what we want to be, is academic. That's our call under God, is to be academic. And if we're too much that way, that's a good thing, because the more you have, the better you're going to be able to minister long term in whatever context God calls you, whether to high school students, on the college campus, or in pulpits. Think of it this way. If you are a carpenter and you show up at someone's home to do the job that you've committed to doing with a screwdriver, you'll probably be sent away. Why? Because you're not equipped. If you show up and your toolbox and your van is full of tools, someone's going to say, this is a person who's got the equipment needed to accomplish the job. We provide that equipment so that you can then begin, in the context of the church, to practice what you have learned at Westminster. That's our goal. That's what we want to do. That's why we do what we do. It is the most practical thing you can do, to study academically and to be too academic in your study so that you can be too practical in the answers and responses that you give in those contexts.